I am Justin in Charlottesville, Virginia, and am the author of Vue Formulate, which is kind of a late player to the form game. It only came out, I think it was maybe in March or something like that we officially published it. So it's been fun to kind of watch the usage grow, and I think it itches some really interesting spots in the form space. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So let me get rolling here. Hopefully you guys can see my slides. The TLDR on this is basically if you want to skip my entire talk, you can just go to vueformulate.com and you can start reading the docs. But hopefully this talk will give a little bit more of a human introduction to what's actually going on here. So who's involved here? This is me. I think you guys can see my video, but I'm actually not 100% sure. So that's me. That's my Twitter handle. This is my co-maintainer, Andrew. We're both in Charlottesville, and we own this little agency called Raid. And we do, all the things that agency do, apps and websites and things like that. But Vue has kind of been our favorite framework for some time now. And so, forms are just one of those things that like nobody really wants to tackle. But it is basically like the meat and potatoes of any web application. Like if you don't have forms, then you're just a brochure. So we have to do them, but we know that they're not particularly fun. Fortunately, in Vue, there's a lot of great tools out there. Vvalidate and Vuelidate and Vuetify, and I mean, there's a lot of tools, and same in React land. There's Formic and a bunch of other good tools. So what does this bring to the table? I think maybe it's helpful to ask the question of what is Vue Formulate not, right? So our tagline is that it's the easiest way to build forms in Vue, and you'll see that kind of splattered throughout the documentation. And I think that's true. But let's dig into it a little bit more. So here's a little short list of what it is and what it is not. Vue Formulate is not a UI framework. So if you're coming from Vuefy or Vuetify or one of these other kind of well-worn Vue places where it's like, oh, I'll just go find this like large set of inputs, left, right justification, all these different column layouts, things like that. We are not that. We're not that. In fact, we're 100% style agnostic. So this was one of my pain points personally, is I like those tools, in particular if I'm rapidly building out some sort of like an admin screen that doesn't have a lot of end user visiting. Basically, if it's not designed, right? So if I, as an engineer, am responsible for building out an admin screen and I'm doing all the design, then I don't really care what it looks like, and I'm fine just defaulting to Material or any of these other kind of frameworks. But that's maybe like 50% of my work. Probably a majority of my work, maybe a little bit more than 50%, is working with designed interfaces. So I've got a design from the client, or maybe I got a design from one of our designers, and now I'm building out an app or an admin framework or something like that. And so I actually want things to be style agnostic, and I think there's a lot of people out there who are like that. You're already a Tailwind user or something like that. You don't necessarily want all of the CSS and UI that comes with a lot of other frameworks. At the same time, it's not renderless. So renderless, as you guys know, is a super hot topic right now in Vue, and for good reason. If you're going to be writing a component, then doing something completely renderless is often desired because you want to arrange and kind of build out the DOM the way you want. And technically with Vue Formulate, you can treat it as a renderless framework, but it's not what we actually want. We actually want people to use the defaults that are in Vue Formulate. And the reason is that there are so many hard edge cases in forms. You have validation, you have accessibility, you have labels and help text, and all of these different pieces and parts that actually go into building every single one of those elements. And if you think about, if you've used if you've used something like, I don't know, Bootstrap, or just written your own HTML forms, you end up kind of with this like large div wrapper and then all of these elements inside, and that gets repeated for every form input. And at some point, you probably extrapolated all of that logic into its own component. And then you've been using that one component to create all of your layout. And essentially what Vue Formulate is that. It's having done that work for you. So we can, at a framework level, begin to think about how do we build this component first API, where what you need to learn as an engineer is components instead of learning like very, very granular little pieces and parts of, how to just do validation or something like that. And it's not unopinionated. It's, in fact, I would call it highly opinionated. So we have a lot of opinions about how forms should be built well, and those are the defaults out of the box. Again, Gusto actually labeled Vue Formulate like the most flexible form system, which I appreciate. Thank you. And I think the reason is because you don't have to follow these opinions. You are more than welcome to take them and run. But I think one of the things that I would want to communicate to people who are starting out with Vue Formulate is, yes, you can do things however you want. But most of the time, you should do things in this particular way. It's not always sexy, but you should probably follow the best practices a lot of the time. And so we want to address the best practices right away. The other thing I see quite a bit is people who are asking, well, doesn't this already exist with vValidate or Vulidate or something like that? And yes, those are awesome validation frameworks. But for Vue Formulate, validation is just like one of the features. There's a lot of features. Validation is one of them. So it is intended to be a comprehensive form authoring library, not just one of the pieces that you need to author your forms well. We get this question a lot too. Is it just HTML, or what's wrong with HTML? And I think it's a fair question, although it's a little bit like walking by somebody building a house and saying like, what's wrong with bricks? HTML is what's used to build the form. We're just taking one level of abstraction higher. So let's run through some of the key features here. First and foremost, it's super easy to learn. This is actually really important to me. I really, really want this to be easy to learn. One of my biggest pet peeves, just not anyone in particular, but just frameworks in general, is always having to go back to the docs to remember like, oh, is that one called a text or a text field or a text input or whatever? And in Vue Formulate, there's literally only two components that you need to learn for all of the input types. And we try to mirror HTML as close as possible in every case. So if we can get as close to HTML as possible, then your learning curve is probably very low. So that's important. It comes out of the box with things like labels and help text and error messages. Form validation is built out of the box too. We have, I want to say 20 rules that ship out of the box, but then it's very easy to add your own rules, including asynchronous ones for backend validation or things like that. This is a super neat feature. It has a form level model binding. So you can bind your entire form with all of the sub inputs inside of it as if it was one V model at the very top. Grouped and repeatable fields. So man, repeatable fields are a huge, huge pain. You create this beautiful form and then your client says, yeah, but I want them to be able to add more than one of those. And then you're in big trouble. So repeatable fields and grouped fields are something that come out of the box. This is a new concept, and I don't know if anybody else is calling them, but I'm going to kind of champion this as an idea. You can extend it with slots, of course, but then you can also use what are called slot components. And so if you imagine a slot in a component that you can put something into, that slot usually has a default position or a default element inside of it. In Vue Formulate, you can actually say what is inside that default position. So what that means, if you don't like the way that we do labels out of the box, you can replace labels not by just replacing one slot. You can replace it for your entire application framework by providing a slot component. So it's a component that'll mount in that slot. And then you can override that one slot component on a case-by-case basis if you want to on top of that. So it's a tremendous level of flexibility. And its main key point, I think, is it's able to keep the API really clean for when you're writing. So one of the things that I think, slots are awesome, but if you have a form that you're using frameworks that only use slots or use a lot of slots, your code becomes almost unreadable. There's just so many different like little slot blocks, and they're not necessarily related to like where they're going to show up on the other side, and it can just get kind of hard to read. So our goal is for you to only need to know one input component, and if you want to override the way that we do things in Vue Formulate, you can use these slot components to do that. Custom inputs. Of course, you can do custom inputs. You can generate forms straight from JSON. So I think this is what our next talk will probably be about to some degree, but basically we have our own form generation schema. Accessibility, we are putting a lot of ARIA tags and things like that on important elements and making sure that they're all related properly. So it's kind of like one of those things that you get by opting into the opinionation of the framework. Backend error handling, man, this is a huge pain point for me. I love using separate backends, whether it's like Express or Laravel or something else to process my forms. And usually I'm using Nuxt or some other Vue SPA on the front end. And when the communication happens and the backend says I've got some errors, that is always a pain. There's always a pain point there of how do I display these errors on my form? And we all know that we should be displaying the errors on the form elements themselves, which elements cause problems. But writing all of the code to get those errors to display in the right place is such a pain. And so with Vue Formulate, you can write one error handler function that will be able to expose to your forms all of the errors. And you can basically just pass it the error object you got from Axios or wherever, and it will distribute those properly throughout your entire form. So it's a massive time saver. Class overrides, another frequent thing is, people need the ability in this modern Tailwind world to put classes on every single little piece of DOM that's in a framework. We want to be able to do that without you having to use slots all the time. And so class overrides allow you to do that. And finally, there's a plugin system. Actually, not finally, I think there's one more point on here. Yeah, the plugin system's pretty powerful. It basically lets you override any piece or part of Vue Formulate. And so by doing that, you're kind of given the opportunity to create your own input mechanisms, whatever they are, and then ship them as NPM packages. And if you're using something like Tailwind, you could even create a theme that's just an NPM package that you install, plug into Vue Formulate, and it's done. Internationalization is actually important. So we ship with default error messages for all of our validation because we just want it to be easy, right? And so I think right now it's maybe up to 15 languages or something like that have been contributed. I'm 99% sure that German is one of them, although I haven't checked in a while. So let's go through. So by the end, I've got what, 7 minutes here, and by the end of this, you guys are all going to be able to use Vue Formulate. Here it is. That's pretty much it. There's Formulate input, so that's the first element. The second element would be a form, and you use it just like you would expect. And once you're done with that, it's time to go profit off your learnings. But seriously, here's how it actually works. So if I've got a Formulate input, by default, it's just going to create, a text input as I would expect. I can just slap a label onto this and it shows up as you would expect, a label. So now we've already kind of supercharged what a default does. Default attributes automatically trickle through to the inner input element. So for example, placeholder is never defined in the Vue Formulate code, but it automatically is able to trickle through to be applied to your inner element. So you can apply any attributes you want to that interior element. You can do things like help text as well. So here is a actual code example. All right, I'm gonna zoom in a little bit. And so this is running in CodePen here, and you can see I've got my Formulate input with all of the same attributes we just defined, but now I've also got validation. And here you can see I want it to be required, and then we use a Laravel style delineation here to break these rules apart. So this first rule is required, second rule is in, and I want it to be in this list here. So if I type and I type something, I don't get any validation, and that's because the default error behavior is to show error messages on blur. So if I click off, you can see it blurs and it shows me the error. You can change that error behavior to be live or on submit or anything like that. So here you can see I've got my validation. If I do Justin, Justin's not an allowed name, but John would obviously clear that error message. So validation is pretty simple. You can create new validation rules very easily as well, and you can even override the validation messages. So another one of my pet peeves is how hard it is to override validation messages. But you can just do it by adding a validation messages prop, and I'm not going to spend time on it because we're running short. But that's how you do that. You can also just change the input type. So this is basically the same, but I just changed the input type to checkbox, and now I get a checkbox. Nothing miraculous about that. It has validation accepted, which basically just makes sure somebody accepts your terms. But I can then also pass options to my checkbox, just in the form of a bound object. And I am able to get this multiple select here. And you can see my validation rules for this are that I need a minimum of 3 and a maximum of 3. So I have to select exactly 3. So 1, 2, 3, my error message goes away, select my 4th. You may only select, you need at least. And the validation messages are, for the most part, pretty intelligent. I mean, you can kind of see here how the language, obviously this is English, but I think the other translations would hold up pretty well here too. They're pretty intelligent about what they're going to show you by default. And again, if you don't like the error messages, they're pretty easy to override. You can override them at a component basis, you can override them on an input type basis, or you can override them globally. Some of the hard things, I think file uploads are always a pain. And we took kind of an opinionated approach to file inputs. So this input here is supposed to allow for images. And let me see if I can find some. Oh yeah, got some right here. So you can see you can do file uploads. It comes with a fake uploader out of the box. And this is literally just a file input that we have put some opinionated styles on the base theme. So there's a base Sass file that you can choose to use or not use that comes with kind of some of these styles. But one of the things that we want you to be able to do is do your file uploads separately from your form submission. So that's the way I think a lot of forms should be done, is you when you're filling out your form and you come to a file upload, it should upload right then. And it should basically allow you to just submit strings to the back end instead of submitting your entire file when you hit submit. And the big reason there is that the user experience is poor if you filled out a long form. Somewhere in that form, you uploaded a file, and then you're just sitting there waiting. So anyway, I could go on a long time on that, but in summary, these are the inputs that come out of the box. And as you can see, for the most part, all of these inputs here are the native HTML inputs. In fact, I think we support every native HTML input, unless it's like one of those old ones that's kind of been deprecated over time. And so this is what comes out of the box. But again, even in the docs, we show an example of how to create what we would consider a synthetic element, like an autocomplete or tag list or something like that. Those are quite easy to implement and use as plugins. The next feature that's important to understand is forms. So here I've got some Formulate inputs, and they're wrapped in a Formulate form. And as you can see, I've just V-modeled the entire form. And so now when I type here, you can see that my form is collecting all of its information back up into this V-model. But it's better than that, because a V-model is a two-way contract. And so if my values here is just a local data attribute. if I manipulate that local data attribute, it will write it back into the form. So you can use that for initial population. You can use that for doing things like masking, all kinds of stuff. You can use a V model for at a form level, which is pretty powerful. Your submission handler also receives all of the data that's been, and it does a deep clone on the data before it hands it off to your submission handler. So if you want to mutate it inside your submission handler, you're not going to be changing the values in your form. There's one other really nifty feature, which is groups. And groups basically allow you to group some data together and kind of structure your data here. So if I go through this and I take a look down here, now you can see I had this address field, and my address field all got chunked inside of this address field as an array, and all of those values were placed inside of there as their own sub-object. So this is a really easy way to group information together in your submitted data. And to do that, all I did was wrap those Formulate inputs that were part of the address in a group tag. And there's one other cool feature here. I realize I'm running out of time. I can do repeatable is true. And wait for CodePen to reload here. And now I actually get this repeatable interface. So put in my address here. And you can see I've got multiple inputs now. And if I look down here, I can accept multiple inputs. And all I needed to do that was wrap the inputs I wanted to be repeatable and slap true on it, and we're good to go. So that's a really big time-saving feature. So anyway, I need to wrap up. These are the features we talked about. So literally just kind of grazing by the surface, scratching the surface. And there's a ton more there, but my time is running out. So further reading, vueformulate.com. I wrote a couple articles here, one just kind of an intro and another one about how to use Formulate with Tailwind. So that might be an interesting read to people. But that's me. Thanks for your time.